Well, good morning, everybody. As Malcolm said, normally we might expect Mike Tolan, our boss, to be here doing this briefing, but today you've got Adam, who is the man who crunches and understands the numbers, and I wield the power of the editorial pen, as well as writing a small part of the report. So, some highlights for you, at least to introduce the story. There's lots of good news, some extremely good news. I've been in the industry 36 years, and this is one of the brightest years I can remember in terms of the commitment to the industry and the capital that is being invested. And those sums of money are staggeringly large, and they're the largest of any industrial sector in this country, as they have consistently been for 30 or more years. And of course, there are lots of good jobs, some extremely highly skilled jobs. Almost half the jobs are here in Scotland. We have increased slightly our estimate of the numbers of people who are supported by the industry. And when we say supported, we mean those that are directly employed, those who are employed right through the wider supply chain, and others whose jobs depend on the expenditure by those people. However, there is a flip side, and the flip side is that production at the moment is going the wrong way. Adam will tell you a bit more about this and about where we hope it will go, but a decline of 14.5% is pretty sharp, and what's more, we have had to revise downwards this year's forecast. As recently as 6 months ago, after our activity survey, we were forecasting something slightly better, as you will see there on the screen. So not a good story there, a huge amount being done, but still nonetheless something that is slightly worrying. And the other less good aspect is the drilling side, particularly exploration and appraisal drilling. Because if we don't drill more, then we are not going to find the potential reserves that are out there. And so that is a crucial aspect of realizing the overall potential of what lies beneath the continental shelf. Nonetheless, don't let's be too gloomy. There is a lot to be proud of. Some other highlights. The industry generates something of the order of £40 billion a year for the British economy. And how do we arrive at that figure? Well, it's made up of clearly the output of oil and gas, which is, of course, the motivation, the driving force, the income that is derived, which funds everything else. But then also on top of that, from the point of view of the economy as a whole, there are the exports which the supply chain is so good at. High-tech exports, high-value exports, and in particular the expertise of the industry's people. And there is potentially plenty out there to go for. We've produced rather more than 40 billion BOE to date, and we have a pretty wide range of forecasts, which you see there, which shows the uncertainties about it all, and also the questions over whether or not the drilling takes place and delivers. Nonetheless, it is a huge prize, and what is excellent is that we have political support through all the major parties, north and south of the border, in our pursuit of recovering as much as economically can be achieved. The other interesting factor which actually has emerged this year is that the latest forecasts out of the Department of Energy and Climate Change show that on their middle range, still about 70% of the primary energy needs of this country are likely to come from oil and gas in 2030. Now, that's about as far ahead as anybody can compare these, given that it's 17 years away. But previously, we had the forecast of that figure at around 2020. It has now been extended, and they're looking at a similar figure 10 years later. So the supply chain, a little bit more on that. There you have the scale of the supply chain. Again, round numbers inevitably. All our numbers in this regard tend to be round because it's difficult to get precision. It doesn't exist. But there we go. That's quite a supply chain sector, and again, one we could be hugely proud of. And of course, we're big contributors to the Treasury. The most recent tax year, although it was down from the previous tax year, which reflects the way the tax allowances work for the enormity of our capital expenditure. Nonetheless, $6.5 billion is a very large sum of money, and we've paid in today's money well over $300 billion over the 40 or so years that the industry has been going, which is a staggering sum of money. I'd sometimes like to prefer to say it as 300,000 million. It sounds more impressive, and perhaps it's something that people can relate to more easily. And on top of that figure, we estimate that the supply chains activities have added something of the order of 5 billion more in corporate and payroll taxes to the exchequer. So that gives you a quick introductory snapshot of the industry and its highlights, and you'll find much more of the detail, of course, in the report. And I'm now going to hand over to Adam, who's going to give you some reflections and some insights into some of the detailed numbers, and then I'll come back at the end and talk a little bit about energy policy and one or two other bits and pieces. Thank you for now.
Good morning, everybody. As David said, my name's Adam Davey, and I'm an analyst within the Economics and Commercial Directorate of Oil and Gas UK. So I'm going to spend the next 15 to 20 minutes now discussing activity on the UKCS. I'm going to begin by looking at the key markets in which the oil and gas industry operates. Barring a dip at the start of the year, oil price has now been consistently above $100 for the best part of 2 years, and it averaged $112 per barrel throughout 2012. This consistently high price has provided a very welcoming backdrop for investment, which is something that will feature heavily later in my presentation. Looking at the gas price, this has also been relatively consistent, operating within the 50 to 65 pence per therm bracket for the majority of the last 24 months. The only deviations that you'll notice come with notable price spikes in February 2012 and March 2013. These were caused largely by supply chain constraints in mainland Europe and high demand as a result of bitterly cold weather. As you'll see on the right-hand side of the gas price, it's risen steadily over the first half of 2013. But even with this increase, gas has still tended to trade at around a 45% discount to oil over the last year or two, averaging around $60 in equivalent terms. So, reserves and resources. The slide behind me shows how Oil and Gas UK categorise the remaining reserves and resources of the UKCS, without which there would simply be no business. On top of the 42 billion BOE that has been extracted to date, Oil and Gas UK believes there is still 15 to 24 billion BOE to come from the UKCS. 11.4 billion BOE of this is in operators' plans, as revealed in the most recent activity survey. You can see this from the bottom 3 bars in the graph behind me. And of that, 7.4 billion BOE is currently in production or has already received sanction, so will definitely be proceeding. The remaining 4 billion BOE are in the pipeline with varying degrees of probability of proceeding, ranging from as low as 10% to as high as 90%. These projects have not yet reached sanction for a number of reasons. Most commonly, they may not sufficiently be mature yet due to recent discovery, or at this stage, they may not meet internal economic criteria at current market and fiscal conditions. However, this is not to say they will never be developed. 2 recent examples of fields that have been discovered decades ago, Mariner and Clare, but have only recently been developed, or in Mariner's case, were in fact only sanctioned earlier this year. We would hope, over time, as technology advances and the fiscal regime evolves, that most, if not all of these remaining 4 billion BOE will be developed. Now, I've included these numbers on the right-hand side of the graph to remind you that these barrels don't come for free. Significant investment is required to reach even the low end of our reserve estimates. The activity survey responses we received in February tell us that companies plan to spend £300 billion if all 11.4 billion BOE in their plans are to be recovered. This is roughly split £100 billion of capital, £160 billion to operate the assets, and £30 to £40 billion to fulfil the legal requirement to decommission the assets at the end of their life. If we look at potential additional resources and yet to find resources, these require further investment still of up to £700 billion. Now, where's this 300 to 700 billion number come from? Well, let's look at a very basic worked example. Unit technical costs in the UKCS are now rapidly approaching £30 per BOE. If we are talking about recovering 10 billion BOE in PARs and yet to find, so somewhere at the top end of our estimates, then that's £300 billion in just capital and operating spend. When we also consider finding costs, decommissioning costs, and the likely cost inflation that will occur over this period, you can soon see how the figure can rise to up to £700 billion. So the key takeaway from this slide is that the resource is out there. We have a business. But up to £1 trillion will be required if we are to maximise recovery from the UKCS. Now, the key to getting most of these barrels, I think everyone will agree, lies in E&A drilling. And after a frankly dismal year in 2011, E&A did pick up in 2012, when 26 exploration and 25 appraisal wells were drilled. However, those black lines that I've just added to the graph show that there has been a notable fall in activity over the last 4 years when compared to the 4 years prior, and this needs to be addressed. Our activity survey in February anticipated strong recovery in 2013, and whilst this is still very possible, early signs are not overly encouraging. Q1 and Q2 data that has recently emerged suggests that at least as many wells will have to be drilled in the second half of the year if we are to meet our forecast on the slide in front of you. Appraisal has been strong, but we hope for a pickup in exploration activity over the second half of the year. It's not all just about activity. The end product of drilling is the discovery of commercial reserves, and results in this area have been particularly disappointing over the last year or two. Most commentators have now revised discovery estimates for 2012 down to less than 50 million BOE in total, and this needs to increase. This is the result of disappointing results of further appraisal drilling on key wells which were thought to hold more recoverable reserves than are now expected. Addressing this is the key aim of the Exploration Task Force, a work stream of Pilot. To summarise here, more E&A drilling is needed and more reserve needs to be discovered if we're going to maximise our recovery and reach the high end of the graph that I showed you on the previous slide. Now let's spend a couple of minutes on the overwhelming good news story of this report. Record levels of capital investment currently being spent in the basin. We expect this to peak at £13.5 billion in 2013, meaning total expenditure in 2013 is likely to comfortably surpass £20 billion. This is the highest on record, even in 2012 money using the Treasury's GDP deflator. An obvious question to ask is how and why has this happened now? Well, mainly because we're developing such huge projects, a lot of which have technically challenging reservoirs. Investment in heavy oil, high pressure, high temperature, and deep water fields are responsible for a significant proportion of the £13.5 billion. Now, a term that my boss likes to use, a wave of investment, has been used a lot by other people as well over the last 12 months. And I think this is a very apt term to describe the 8 fields which have been approved since the beginning of 2010 only, that are expected to carry more than 100 million barrels of oil equivalent apiece. As well as this, you've got the Brownfield Allowance, announced last September, which has had a material impact on investment, and we expect will continue to do so over the coming years. There has been an element of cost inflation. No one can pretend that a pound of capex buys the same as it did in 5, 10, or 20 years ago, let alone the 1970s, but this has certainly not been the major factor in this investment. Can this level of investment be maintained? Well, Oil and Gas UK believes that £8 to £10 billion per year is probably the optimal equilibrium level of investment, as you can read in the report. We feel less than that would not sustain production, but more than that over a long period of time may stretch the supply chain. Now I'm going to come on to production, which, as David said, has not been a particularly good news story over the last couple of years. There are many uncertainties that range around production, and I'm going to attempt to explain some of them now. The graph behind me here shows that production to the end of May is just over 1.4 million barrels of oil equivalent per day. As you can see clearly, outturn in the second half of the year is consistently worse than the first half. You can see the dips that occur. This has been true for each of the last 15 years, so we see it very hard to be turned around. In the last 3 years in particular, production has fallen by at least 0.2 million barrels of oil equivalent per day from the first half figure compared to the full year figure. The dip that we see in each of these lines is caused by summer maintenance in the months of July, August and September, and has been exaggerated in recent years as maintenance programs have become extended and sometimes overrun. So those are the pressures that are forcing these lines down. The good news is that there is potential upside. Oil and Gas UK predicted that 14 new fields would start up in 2013, and there have only been 4 to date, so we can reasonably expect 10 in the second half of the year, most notably the large Jasmine field. Other pressures trying to force this line up are old fields that have been shut in for one reason or another and are expected to come back or pick up in the second half of the year. We expect improved production from Elgin in the second half of the year, and the FPSOs of Banff and Griffin are likely to come back on stream. The key point here is that there are a range of uncertainties, hence our range of forecast, 1.2 to 1.4 million BOE per day. You'll notice that the line levels out once you get past September, and I think all will become clear when this data is available. It comes at around a 2-month lag, so watch this space. I'll now have a look at actual production, and then talk a bit about our outlook beyond 2013. You'll see by those red lines that I've just added in that there was a steady decline of 7 to 8%, which can be tolerated in a maturing basin like this. We saw this for a number of years prior to 2010. But since 2010, the severe declines of 16 to 17% per annum have been seen, and this is quite unacceptable. It cannot be blamed purely on the geology of the UKCS. Overruns on maintenance, leading to extended shutdown periods, are culpable for much of this problem, and some unplanned shutdowns have caused a major headache as well. So if we look to beyond 2013, the new fields currently being invested in will deliver production. That we are sure of. However, production will only increase as we have forecast, and as you can see behind me here, if we address the problem with base production. The key lies with the performance of currently operating assets in the UKCS, which are no longer as reliable as they used to be for one reason or another. If we can achieve this improvement, we still believe we can reach 2 million barrels of oil equivalent a day by 2017 or sometime towards the end of the decade. If not, unfortunately, the future of the UKCS will come under some strain. So, this base production that I talk about, to measure the performance of it, a metric has been labelled production efficiency, and this has been used now it's been talked about for the last few months in a lot of detail. Production efficiency equates to actual throughput over the maximum production potential of a field, and as you can see, it's fallen drastically from upper 80% in 2004 to now nearer 60% in 2012. To put this into some kind of context for you, our analysis shows that for every 1% increase in production efficiency that can be achieved in 2013, an extra 9 million barrels of oil equivalent will be extracted from the UKCS. The prize of getting this right absolutely cannot be understated. The Production Efficiency Task Force, under the guise of pilot, is currently focusing on this. Now I'll take a look at operating costs. As far as operating costs go, this line is relatively flat, so that indicates that cost control has been well managed over the last 10 to 15 years. You will notice higher than average increases over the last 2 years. That little uplift at the end of the graph you can see there. They've been 10% per annum for the last 2 years now, and we believe this will happen again in 2013. However, the increase has been concentrated over a small number of fields where major maintenance work has taken place. It is important to consider that the median increase in operating spend per field since 2011 has actually only been, it's been just under 5% in fact. So the 10% mean average increase that you see is not necessarily representative. This is good news. There has evidently been a health and safety reaction post-Macondo, and it's put a lot of strain, it's put a lot of call on the industry's supply chain services in this area. Now, a somewhat less bright story around unit operating costs. Well, I've just spent the last 10 minutes telling you that production performance has been fairly poor over the last 2 years, and operating costs have risen steadily at the same time. So it should come as no surprise that I'm now showing you a graph showing unit operating costs have risen dramatically. They are now over £13 per barrel in 2012, a figure that we can only see rising by the end of this year. There is a very wide range of operating costs in the UKCS, both in terms of field and area. Some fields operate at less than £5 per BOE. These are mostly small southern North Sea gas fields. At the other end of the scale, there are some fields that are as expensive as £40 per BOE, usually found in the northern North Sea. Fields at the high end of this range will be forced to shut in and could face premature decommissioning if unit operating costs continue to rise in this fashion. The assets simply won't be economical to operate. Price exposure also plays into this discussion. If the oil price were to creep down, then fields with expensive unit operating costs may not be able to continue running. Again, it's a matter of economics. This is clearly a very delicate and precarious situation, but it ultimately feeds back to the production problem. If we can address the production problem, then unit operating costs will clearly improve as a result. So, I can't quite get through this presentation without mentioning tax in some capacity. It's clearly a serious part of the UKCS business, and many of you in the audience will know profits within the oil and gas ring fence pay significantly more tax than those in other businesses. The top bar I show here shows older PRT fields that pay a marginal rate of tax of up to 81%. The second bar is probably representative of most fields in the UKCS, where 62% tax is paid. The bar beneath that shows fields that are in receipt of an allowance. They will pay somewhere in the range of 30 to 62%. However, it's very rarely as low as 30%. Field allowances were introduced and consequently expanded from 2008, and they have proved beneficial to both industry and exchequer. Many investments, especially those targeted, would not proceed without these allowances. By the end of 2013, we anticipate that over £6 billion will have been spent on fields in receipt of an allowance, and this number will almost double by the end of next year. These fields are making a material contribution to total investment. It is important to note that field allowances only last for a finite period of time. Once the allowance has been consumed, however valuable it may be, the field returns to paying the full rate of SCT, and therefore a 62% marginal rate of tax, or, in fact, 81% if it's subject to PRT. The thing that I'm trying to get with this slide is that the minimum tax rate an oil or gas field in the UKCS will pay is 30%, and the bottom bar shows you that this is still 7% higher than other industries. Allowances can absolutely not be seen as subsidies, as they offer no coverage of costs. They simply allow a lower marginal rate of tax to be paid in specific instances. Now, the fiscal regime is going to need to continue to evolve as the dynamic of the UKCS develops, so don't expect this picture to stay static for too long. Before I hand back to David, I just want to let you know that I've talked about a lot of negative things in this report, as well as the positive things around capital investment. But the industry and government are aware of the problems we face, and they know their severity. Initiatives are in place to address these issues. Pilot, an industry and government body, now has 5 work streams currently working on major top-line industry issues. Then we have the Economic and Fiscal Forum that provides a vehicle for industry and Treasury to discuss and review the fiscal regime in place for oil and gas operations in the UK. The government has recently commissioned what is being known informally, at least for now, as the Wood Review, an independent review of the UK continental shelf to maximise the economic benefits of the offshore oil and gas production and to improve safety. Oil and Gas UK eagerly awaits conclusions that arise from that, which are likely to be early in the new year. So just to summarise before I hand back to David, the term a 2-speed UKCS has been one that I've heard used a lot over the last 2 years, and I think that still rings very true. Whilst on one hand we've got the positive news story around capital investment, the production and E&A drilling side of the business needs to improve, and it needs to improve soon. But government and industry are working together to ensure this happens. Now I'll hand back to David, who's going to talk to you about supply chain issues and energy policy. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, Adam. Right, so perhaps just a little bit more on the supply chain, given how important it is in this industry. There you see a depiction of the supply chain's financial results over recent years. Revenues rising steadily, but interestingly, profits not doing the same thing until more recently. We haven't got the detail of 2012's figures yet, unfortunately. That would be interesting. But clearly, it is a success story, and something we can be very proud of, and something that the government recognised with the publication of its industrial strategy at the end of March, sponsored by both DEC, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and BIS, the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills. As mentioned before, those are the sales figures in round numbers. They are impressive. The overseas markets, which particularly dominate the export side, are there: North America, West Africa, and the Middle East, but plenty of others as well. Subsea engineering. Aberdeen is a centre of excellence. This country is a centre of excellence in worldwide subsea engineering. There is no doubt about that whatsoever. But I have to say that, unfortunately, we do actually lack good information. We really don't have enough in order to flesh out this story and tell it in its fullness. We need somehow collectively to achieve that in order to do justice to what has been built and developed over the last 40 or so years. Now, there is an exercise in hand to map the supply chain and try and understand just exactly what it consists of, because there is that sort of warm feeling that actually it's bigger and better than any of us truly appreciates. But we haven't got a grip of actually how we can measure it and therefore define it. And of course, this plays straight back to that industrial strategy which I mentioned a moment ago. And just to expand the numbers of people involved, here are our latest figures based upon work that we have done and using others to help us. Some 36,000 directly employed by operators and around 200,000 employed in supply chain. Now, you'll immediately say, golly, that's a round number. Well, indeed, it is a round number, because the supply chain is so extensive, it can actually be very difficult to determine just what that number should be with any precision. But we're pretty confident that that is the right order. And I mentioned earlier what we call induced jobs. These are the jobs which arise as a result of the expenditure by the 36,000 and the 200,000. So clearly in a place like Aberdeen, you see it in the taxi ranks, you see it in the hotels, legal services, property, and so on and so forth. And that, to that is added a hefty number in the export of goods and services, giving us a total of the order of 450,000 jobs supported by this industry right throughout the economy. It really is most impressive. And certainly when I go around and talk to people about these numbers, those who are not connected with the industry are usually stunned. They have no idea at all. Well, you know, too many people don't realize the industry exists. I mean, you listen to some of the TV and radio stuff, and you wouldn't think we'd got an oil and gas industry. That went long ago, came and it went. How wrong it is. We need to be able to tell the story. And of course, perversely, we're seeing skills shortages in a number of areas, something which again is being addressed actively. Now let's switch tack slightly. I'm just going to say a few words about energy policy. Some of you have heard me talk about this before, but this is a very striking new graph which we have received courtesy of ExxonMobil. Some of you will have been something like it before, but it splits the world into two in terms of its future energy demand. And it splits it into the OECD countries on the right and the non-OECD on the left. And for those of you who don't know what the OECD is, it's the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Essentially, it's a rich countries club. So the traditional Western European, North American, Japan, and so on are in the right-hand graph. And all the up-and-coming, booming countries, China, India, Brazil, and so on and so forth, are in the left-hand side of that graph. And you can see the extraordinary scale between those two sets of countries. And you can also see the dominance of the traditional fossil fuels of oil, gas, and coal. and the relatively modest contributions which are made by other forms of energy supply and expected to be made, even looking as far ahead as 2040 and peering that far into the future, is getting close to heroic. Some of you will also have seen this policy triangle before. This represents, in a simple diagram, the three main overarching principles guiding energy and climate policy in both the European Union and in this country. Reduction in emissions, as indicated there, but doing so whilst achieving security of supply and doing it all in an affordable manner which keeps the economy economic and growing and competitive. But one of the most striking things that has happened over the last years is this. North America is heading back to self-sufficiency in gas, and that's expected within a few years, whereas previously they were looking to import more and more and more. And there is now the prospect that North America will become self-sufficient once again in oil. And if you had said that 5 years ago, people would have looked at you in total disbelief. If you'd said it of gas 10 years ago, they would have looked at you in total disbelief. And given how large the North American market is, that is very, very significant. And it's already upset the world markets in gas because their price is so low, whereas everybody else's prices are significantly higher. But the result of that has meant that they've reduced their consumption of coal so much, they've exported a lot of coal, and that has crashed the price of coal in almost all the remaining markets of the world. And the net result is people are burning more coal than they were doing just 3 years ago. In this country, energy consumption broadly breaks into three. Roughly 1/3 goes into transport, where, of course, oil is dominant. 1/3 or so goes into heat, where gas is far and away the most important fuel. And about 1/3 goes into the production of electricity, where, of course, there is a mixture of competing sources of energy. Coal is up at the moment in this country. Gas is down. Nuclear is pretty steady, but that will decline because so many old nuclear power stations are going to close. And, of course, there is some contribution from renewables. And worryingly, the debate that you hear on the radio, you read in the press and so on, hear on the TV, politics and so on, it's almost all about electricity. You wouldn't think heat and transport existed almost. And when you hear the noises about gas, it's nearly always around the use of gas in electricity, forgetting that 80% of our homes are heated by gas, as are large proportions of commercial and industrial heat. But for the climate change warriors and those who are genuinely concerned that something dreadful is happening, this is where they should turn their attention. It is the consumption of coal more than anything else which is driving the problem. And according to the IEA, all but 50% of the rise in total energy demand over the last 10 years has been satisfied by coal. And it's coal's use in power generation that is driving that, because in the developing world, the expansion of electricity supplies is simply meteoric. So in climate change terms, coal is the overriding problem. And actually, if you could switch out of coal and into gas for power generation, which is obviously technically perfectly possible and affordable, it is one of the most immediate ways of stemming the problem. But we also need, in my view, a huge amount more to be done in research and development. And in particular, I think carbon capture and storage, or some technology of that nature, is going to be crucial, because somehow something will have to be done, particularly with coal. And we also need to find ways of storing energy, which at the moment is extremely difficult. In fact, in electricity, of course, it's well nigh impossible, other than in very small quantities. So, to draw this to a conclusions, let us come back to ourselves and this industry. It is a great industry to be in. As I mentioned earlier, I've been in 36 years, and I haven't regretted any of those years at all. So we're going to get lots of new investment, or we're getting it. This should give production a very significant boost in the second half of this decade. And remember that the more we produce, the less we have to import, back to the public perception about this industry and how important that is. And the more jobs we create, the more tax we pay, the more wealth creation there is. And imports don't do that at all. They don't support the supply chain. They don't pay any production-related taxes. They don't provide the kind of jobs which we do, particularly high-class jobs, high-value jobs. The average pay in this industry is twice the national average. Just imagine the implications of that from the point of view of taxation, revenue, economic activity, and so on. But as we've mentioned, existing production is problematic, as is drilling. The decline of 7 to 8% a year has doubled in recent years, and hence the importance of actually getting something concrete out of these initiatives and the Wood Review, because it's up to all of us to help achieve that remaining prize. We're all in it, and we can all achieve something from it. We can all benefit from it. Let us hope that that is what collectively we do. Thank you very much.